Well, the whole job situation is not looking too great right now. As I've said recently, that'll be the final shoe to drop in this economy before we see things start to go off a cliff. There's a pretty strong consensus that it is the health of the consumer that has been propping up our economy. And the consumer spending has really been driven by the wealth effect for one thing, and cheap credit on the other hand. And you could say that the wealth effect generated by the rising stock market making people feel richer, feel like the economy is doing well. That too is also generated by cheap credit. Credit right now, though, isn't cheap because of market forces. It's cheap, because of artificial price fixing by the Federal Reserve, and that sort of thing's not really sustainable. When you have artificially cheap credit, what ends up happening is people just end up taking out a lot more debt than they otherwise would have, and they get a lot more indebted, and eventually, they've used up all their credit. No matter how low the interest rate is, you really can only charge so much. Debt in the economy cannot continue to rise, forever, at least not in a straight line. Debt is like a tumor on an economy. We've seen plenty of countries where they get bogged down in debt, and no matter how low they try and fix their interest rates, they just can't get out of that slump because they're held down by this massive weight. That's the position where so many U.S. consumers find themselves today, and the only response that they can come up with is to cut back on their spending. That they cannot continue taking out debt to buy more furniture and more televisions and a bigger house. For a time, these folks feel like they have to live within their means and stop expanding their debt so that they can service the debt that they already have. Of course, when they stop expanding their debt, however, they're not going to consume as much. So in effect, consumption is going to fall. It's going to fall until it reaches a level that is, somewhat sustainable for this economy, a level of consumption that is proportional to the amount of income that the consumers are actually, taking in. In doing so, however, the retail sector and the goods producing sector, essentially, transportation, all these things that are tied up in consumption, all of these sectors that benefit from domestic consumption, they too will have to cut back, because now, since the domestic consumption is not going to be hopped up as much on the debt heroin, well, then they don't need as much of their infrastructure or their employment. They don't need so many office buildings. They don't need so many employees. They don't need so many truck drivers. They don't need so many people working the floor in retail spaces. And so it's in those areas that we would expect the economy to finally start to show signs of weakness, because it is when consumers stop expanding their debt so much, and so consequently have to cut back on consumption, that you will see layoffs in those sectors. And the ADP jobs number, which is different from the non-farm payroll report. This is not an official number from the government. This is a survey done by a firm called ADP. They're essentially a polling firm, and they call around a bunch of businesses and stuff, and they try and get an estimate of how many jobs were created in the country in a given month. And so in November, they were expecting there to be created somewhere between 135,000 and 150,000. I'm seeing conflicting reports. CNBC says the estimate was 125 or 150,000. Zero Hedge is saying the estimate was 135,000. Either way, it didn't meet either of those expectations, because it only came in at about 67,000, which is dismal. Obviously, way below expectations, way below where you would think things would be if consumption was rising. Now, some of you might be saying, oh, but that's still a positive number. How can you say that's a bad thing? The economy still added jobs. So, what's wrong here? Well, if you look deeper into the jobs, not really the jobs report, into this survey, how it breaks down by sector would seem to lend credence to what I was saying earlier about the slowdown resulting from a reduction in consumption. So if we look at goods producing sectors like, mining, manufacturing, and construction, they were actually down for the month, down by about 18,000. So about 18,000 people in those sectors on net lost their jobs. Now, part of the losses in mining and manufacturing you could chalk up to trade war stuff because, of course, they're much more susceptible to international economics because manufacturers also do a lot of exporting. Same thing with mining; they're going to export some of their raw materials. So you could say, okay, that doesn't necessarily have to do with the American economy. That can have to do with weakness abroad or trade wars or other things like that. But in construction, that's something that is entirely tied to our economy. And construction is something that is a sector that does extremely well when rates are cheap, when debt is cheap, and when people can afford to borrow a lot more money than they otherwise would. That's when people build much bigger houses. They build a lot more houses. The businesses like to build these giant skyscrapers. Some of you might have heard of the skyscraper curse. There's also a good book on that topic by Mark Thornton. The idea is that whatever the tallest building in the world happens to be, whenever someone wants to build a new tallest building in the world, they start doing that when the economy is in a boom, and by the time that the tower actually becomes, not necessarily when it's completed, but by the time that the structure gets tall enough to be the tallest building in the world, there's a recession. And without getting down that rabbit hole, that's just an example of how when credit is cheap, when everyone can borrow a lot of money, people are going to try and do very ambitious construction projects. When the economy's tapped out, however, in the sense that it has too much debt, you would obviously expect construction to start to recede a bit, because people cannot borrow as much money to build new buildings. Now, moving on to the services sector, services was actually up 85,000. So all of the gain and more for the month came from services. The goods-producing sector, of course, like I already said, lost 18,000. So services are up 85,000. However, within the services sector, trade and transportation is down 15,000. And that, again, is connected to the weakness in the consumer that I was talking about. Trade is commerce, it's retail, and transportation, of course, is heavily tied to retail because you have the truck drivers that deliver all of the goods to the stores. Well, if there's not as many goods being sold, well, then you don't need to deliver as many goods to the stores, and you don't need as many truck drivers. So all the data in this ADP number seems to support my thesis, at least to a certain extent. Of course, we'll need multiple months, and of course we'll want to see the non-farm payroll reports before I take a victory lap and say, "Hooray, the economy's crashing." And that's a joke, by the way. I never say, "Hooray, the economy's crashing." But my point is to say that you should be able to see these things coming from a mile away. When people say that nobody predicted the crash of 2008 or whatever recession before that, that's just a lie. There are always people who predict it. There are always people who see it coming and say, like, "Oh, well, you didn't call the exact quarter that would go into recession." It's like, who cares? Nobody's trying to do that. But you can see when the seeds have been planted for a recession, that's bad news. And you could say, okay, well, maybe now it's checkout time, or maybe not. I mean, you can't call the exact date, but you can say, hey, there's this weakness in the economy that I'm seeing here, and that's going to end badly. That's all people are saying. So therefore, they're predicting it. That doesn't make a crash unpredictable. And besides, I mean, it's perfectly possible to have an economy without those sorts of underlying weaknesses that I mentioned, if you don't manipulate the credit markets and distort the structure of production and things like that. So anyway, back to what actually gained in jobs over this past month. It was stuff like hospitality, tourism, restaurants, I think, and financial services, of course. So people don't seem to be really changing their lifestyle so much. They're just not going to the store and buying as many goods, if that makes sense. So, retail is a very obvious thing when you do it. It's kind of like the difference between, paying with a credit card versus paying in cash. You feel it a lot more when you pay in cash. The same is true if you're going out shopping at a store and you're buying individual items. It's a lot easier to just not do that than it is to, say, just not eat or to eat at a cheaper restaurant, because eating is a very routine daily habit for people. So going to a restaurant, they're not as likely to cut back on that as they are to, say, just buy less stuff from the store. And of course, financial services, that's an elite sort of sector. So, they're not servicing for the most part, the common, ordinary consumers anyway. So the health of of average people doesn't really affect their sector because, of course, the rich are getting richer all the time because the stock market is still going up. So that's the ADP jobs number this month. I will be waiting with bated breath for the NFP, the non-farm payroll report, which is the official jobs number, and to see if that is consistent with what ADP's got going on here. And of course, we want to wait still a couple more months to see if this trend continues. But ADP has been trending lower for the last few months. So this might be the beginning of the end. The yield curve has not been debunked. So this would be consistent with where the yield curve is at right now. Now, with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do hit subscribe because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.